Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video I'm going to be offering a few tips to the piano accompanist. Now, there are some wonderful piano accompanists in the world. I've known some amazing piano accompanists in my lifetime, and it's just a joy to listen to them work. But there are loads of people out there who find themselves having to do some accompanying. People who never really set out to be accompanists, but maybe end up accompanying a choir just because maybe there's the most obvious person to ask, even though it's not particularly their thing. Lots of people who teach instruments, and then they have this sort of terminally dread of having to accompany their own students for music exams or local music festivals or auditions, all this kind of stuff, accompanying people in school concerts, all this kind of thing. So a lot of people get quite anxious about having to do that. So it doesn't matter what your level of this is. I'm just hoping that by giving these 5 tips, it's going to help enhance what you do, that you'll just maybe feel a little bit more confident for thinking about these things. So it's not an exhaustive list, but it's just 5 things just to think about. And if you can tick all the boxes on these tips, well, great, just keep doing what you're doing. But there may be something you look at and think, oh yeah, actually maybe that would be the thing that would help me to be a bit more confident about what I'm doing. So what are the 5 tips that I'm going to offer you? Well, the first one is this, which may seem an obvious one. Know your part really well. Now, why have I put that there? Because it's a bit obvious, isn't it? Know your part really well. Sometimes I find pianists put a huge amount of effort into practicing, into learning their solo pieces. Then when they come to accompany, actually they don't really put the same effort into it at all. They kind of take the view that, well, somebody else is the soloist, I'm just going to busk along as best I can behind, and they're not quite so fussy with what they're doing. But it's an integral performance. It's not about the soloist and somebody donging the piano. This is about the soloist and the pianist, or the choir and the pianist. And actually the accompanist has the ability, the power, if you like, to make or break a performance. And I know that when you hear a really good accompanist, they sometimes lift the ability of the soloist or the choir or whatever it is, and kind of encourage them to do an even better job than they were naturally going to do in the first place. I've also sadly heard the opposite, where you've got a soloist who's doing a perfectly decent job, but they're being kind of sabotaged by what's going on at the piano because the pianist just cannot play the notes at the right speed, or is just bashing away, kind of fighting from one note to the next. So know your part really well. And that doesn't just mean the notes, but it's thinking, actually, have I got the notes sorted? Have I got the phrasing sorted? Have I got the dynamics sorted? Have I really soaked up all the detail the composers put in the score? And have I started to think a little bit about, actually, how am I going to put this across? How am I going to deliver the structure of this, or the shape within a phrase? All these things. So you've really got to grips with your own part very well before you engage with the soloist or the choir, whoever it is you're accompanying. Okay, so that's tip number 1. Now, tip number 2 is similar but equally important. Know the other part or parts really well. So here's something else that can go wrong for accompanists. There are people who've sort of ticked the box for number 1. They practice their own part. They've got that all going quite nicely, and that's great. But they've no idea what's going on elsewhere. So they've no idea what the solo violinist, flautist, trumpeter, whatever is doing, or what the choir is doing. So they don't really know how their part fits in with it, or what's going on musically. So you get all sorts of problems, like you suddenly realise that an accompanist is playing a beat behind the soloist, and they don't know the soloist part well enough to move up a beat. It may not be their fault that it's gone wrong, it might be, but it might be that the soloist has done some rhythmic miscalculation and has moved a beat out, Well, there's no point in carrying on playing a beat behind, is there? It's much better to move up and be straight on it. Now, how are you going to be able to do that? Because you know that solo part really well, or you know those choir parts really well, you know exactly what it's supposed to sound like, and then you can really match up with them. But also, you've got to think about other things. I mean, for example, if you're accompanying a singer or accompanying a wind player or a brass player, when are they going to breathe? Because you need to breathe with them. You know, arguably at the piano, you don't need to breathe ever. I mean, you need to breathe to stay alive, of course. But in terms of playing the piano, you know, we've got to lift off at the end of a phrase. But actually, if we just want to play legato for the rest of our lives, well, that's fine. The music doesn't need to breathe. So it's an important thing for a piano accompanist to think about. When do people need to breathe? What's going to happen when a string player lifts a bow and starts with a fresh bow? You know, we've got to be able to time things to fit in with that. So those kind of details are really important. When does your soloist need to do something like that? When do new phrases begin? What are the implications of bowing and all these kind of things? You know, when does the soloist need a little bit more support? When maybe they're moving higher in the range, and therefore, if you're aware of that, here's a moment that's going to be just a little bit more demanding for them. Can I support them in a way? You know, can I just open up my dynamic scale a little bit just to help them with that? You know, can I work with them? So you're not just thinking, well, I'm playing my part, you're doing yours, and let's hope we meet together at the end. Because a lot of accompanying does go like that. So knowing the solo part really well, not just the notes, the phrasing, the dynamics, what's going on musically, what's likely to be difficult for the soloist to do. And the same would apply to choirs or instrumental ensembles who might be accompanying, all that kind of stuff. Okay, now then, here's the third thing that I just want to think about, and it's this question of balance. This is a very important thing to think about if you're an accompanist. I can think of all sorts of examples of accompanying that I've heard over the years where the pianist is just too loud. So they sort of drown out the soloist or the choir or whatever they're accompanying. And we've just got all this volume coming from the piano. And, you know, you just wish that they would either tone it down or just pack up altogether, because it would be easier to hear the soloist without all this going on. And it's not really a partnership. It's not really showing sensitivity to the accompanist role. It's about dominating the performance. Now, I think circumstances can move around a little bit here. Sometimes, for example, if you are an experienced musician accompanying a player who's not very experienced, who needs a bit more confidence, who maybe needs a little bit of a pulse driving into the accompaniment to help them, there may be examples in those scenarios where maybe you're not going to be as finessed about the balance just because you're just going to give them a bit more confidence by playing up a little bit. That doesn't mean drowning them. It just means being a little bit more present than otherwise you might want to be. As soon as you're accompanying people who are perfectly capable of doing this, you're doing a much more subtle job in this accompanying role by balancing very carefully your part against the prime parts. Now, it doesn't just mean what's the balance between you and a soloist or you and a choir. It also means, you know, balancing your textures really well. When you're playing chords, is it the top note that needs a bit more weight? Is it the bottom note? Is there something in the middle? Do we just want to make sure that major third in the middle of the chord has just come through because we've just come out of some minor tonality or something, you know? So balancing textures is the important thing, whether that's about what's happening in the texture between you and soloists or whether it's what's happening within the piano part. So obviously there's this overall thing that usually we need to accompany at a dynamic level below that of the soloist, but there's all this nuance to go for as well. But there are also times when there is actually primary material in the piano part when the soloist is actually accompanying the piano. And this is something that often people miss as well. Those who are sensitive enough to sit behind a soloist and accompany, but then sometimes are reluctant to come forwards when they need to. So quite often you'll hear a melodic line, a theme that's in the solo line, then it comes back in the piano part. Well, when it comes back in the piano part, that needs to have some kind of primary emphasis. And it may be that the soloist is moving into the role of accompanist, sustaining long notes or just doing a bit of figuration in the middle of the texture, while you have a line that's singing out over the top of that or underneath it. So this is what I mean about balancing textures in every way that we need to do that. Drawing attention to colour in the harmony and colour in the texture as well. So we've got all of that stuff going really well. So there's sometimes something conversational going on between soloists and accompanists. Same's true when you're accompanying choirs as well. Often the choir's got something important to say, suddenly the choir stops, it's just you on your own. Okay, what's going to happen in that bit you're doing on your own? Sometimes the choir might just have quiet sustained chords. There's a melodic line that's in the piano part or in the orchestral reduction that's formed the piano part that you need to draw attention to. So it's kind of like this whole thing about fine-tuning every aspect of balance. I think is a really important role for an accompanist. Okay, tip number 4, have plenty of musical ideas of your own. Now, what do I mean by this? What I mean by this is that sometimes as the accompanist, if you're just taking this kind of notion that you're just the accompanist, you know, it's the choir that's important, the soloist is important, that's all true. So you don't really kind of think that you have to take any musical responsibility for what's happening. You know, you're just going to turn up, you're going to play the piano part, it's up to them what they do. That's never going to give you a really engaging musical performance, is it? So come with plenty of ideas. I mean, one of your kind of responsibilities is to discover how the soloist wants to interpret the music, or how the conductor wants to interpret the music in the case of a choir maybe. You've got to support them in every way possible. So you kind of want to come with lots of ideas of your own that you may be able to just not even discuss, but you just play things in such a way that the other people you're accompanying pick up on and think, oh, that sounds lovely. When you deliver that little crescendo and diminuendo there, that really works well. That little pause in the tempo, little holding up of tempo at that point really places that cadence beautifully. They'll pick up on your musical ideas sometimes and go with the flow. And you don't even have to discuss it when you're in the best situations. Sometimes you might have to discuss it. You might say, well, I know you're playing it like that. I just kind of feel it this way, and this is why. You know, have some reasoning behind that, and then you can negotiate a position. The soloist might say, "Look, I really don't want to do that." Well, okay, you give in at that point. But sometimes they'll say, "Oh yeah, actually, that's a really interesting thought. I'd not really considered that," and you get this wonderful interplay if you come with lots of ideas, and you'll pick up on their ideas as well. And that's one of the things that I've always enjoyed most about being an accompanist, actually, is just working with other musicians, and sometimes without even discussing it, just thinking, oh, that's a really clever touch, that's lovely, that really does set that moment off beautifully, I've got that, and now I'm going to do the same thing somewhere else as well just to match that. Or sometimes I've been fortunate enough to be able to suggest something that has helped the soloist do things in a way that's perhaps more pleasing to them on balance. I love that interaction that you have with other musicians when you're accompanying. So there should be no sense of tug of war between soloist and accompanist. It's an absolutely joint partnership working together. Which brings us to point number 5. It's got to be one performance. By which I mean this. There are times when you hear, well, here's the soloist doing one thing, here's the pianist doing something else, and it sort of fits together, but they don't kind of see this the same way at all. And sometimes there's a sort of bit of a battle on between them. So you've got two performers working together in the case of a soloist and an accompanist, or you've got a unit like a choir or a chamber group or whatever it is, and a piano accompanist. But this is about these musicians fusing their thoughts together, fusing their playing together and really being attentive to everything that's happening. And it's not just about notes or ensemble or all these obvious things. I mean, I haven't actually really talked about obvious things like make sure you play in time with each other. I'm sort of assuming that that's something that most accompanists would want to do. You know, ensemble's terribly important, isn't it? But for example, there's no point in a soloist detaching notes in one way if every time the accompanist detaches them much more severely. Same musical idea, it's articulated one way by one person, another way by the other. Well, there's got to be a meeting of minds. You can have a discussion about it if you need to. Or you can think, okay, I just need to change the way I'm doing that to match up with what's happening here. You know, this kind of tussle that you sometimes get where the soloist wants to play at this speed, the accompanist wants to play at that speed, and we're kind of doing this all the way through. And so the accompanist is always shoving the soloist in the back or always putting the brakes on. And, you know, we've got to have a meeting of minds, a meeting of musical imagination, so that one of the wonderful things about accompanying when it goes well is that you have such this kind of blended thing with the person you're accompanying, that the two are one. And that's wonderful when you get one performance absolutely zapping along. So really I put that on there because that's what we're trying to achieve, isn't it? And what is it that we need to do in order to make that happen? I spent years accompanying a trumpeter actually, and we often saw eye to eye on the way we did things. We didn't have to discuss lots of things actually, but sometimes in rehearsal I was a bit surprised that he decided to play at a tempo that I hadn't considered or to articulate in a way that hadn't occurred to me. And you know, we had a discussion or we just kind of moved to each other in some shape or form, but that was the real joy of it, arriving at a point where we both went on stage and thought we know how we're presenting a unified performance and we're each playing our part in making that happen. So that's why that's such an important point. Many other things we could talk about, but there we are. Know your part really well, know the other parts really well, think really carefully about issues of balance, lots of musical ideas, interaction between you and the other performers, and ultimately head for one performance that's absolutely unified. I hope there's something in that of value to piano accompanists.